After the invasion, the Foreign Office then sent out an email saying, we need volunteers to administer Iraq before we hand it back to the Iraqis. So I was very much against the war, but I wanted to go to Iraq, apologize to Iraqis for the war, and help them rebuild their country. I didn't want the only foreigner that Iraqis would ever meet to be a man with a gun. So I got to Kirkuk and I was told, I am now the senior civilian responsible for administering the province and reporting directly to Ambassador Bremer in Baghdad. So that's how I found myself governing a province.
In Iraq, first-time visitors to Baghdad were making critical decisions about governance. The question remained, what was the plan? Where was Iraq going?
And I realized that Iraqis took my role quite seriously when in the first week, insurgents came to my house and fired mortars at it. 2 days later, it was RPGs at it. Now, I was busy apologizing to everyone for the war and soon realized that they weren't interested in my apologies. What they were interested in was what we were going to do for them. Iraqis expected us to turn Iraq into Dubai within 6 months. They're like, it's America, can put a man on the moon.
America couldn't be screwing up in Iraq by mistake, many Iraqis whispered. They must be tolerating chaos on purpose. Looting, power outages, rampant corruption, murder, kidnapping. It was becoming a nightmare.
Initially, people received us well for the most part, but they really had such great expectations that we overpromised and under-delivered. You know, as soon as de-Baathification came and dissolving the military, the people that we had on side then saw us as their enemies. In Kirkuk, we had schools without teachers, we had hospitals without doctors, and we tried to rehire them on SERP funds, tried to put them as janitors, in theory, keeping them in their jobs. But sooner or later, that money ran out.
SERP, or Commander's Emergency Response Program, was essentially walking around money to pacify local tribal and village leaders. These were band-aids to solve problems that required a strategy.
After 30 years of totalitarian rule, the people of Iraq are at last free. In the last few months, they've begun to enjoy life on their own terms. They've started to embrace the responsibility that freedom entails.
Ambassador Bremer was adamant that the US was not a colonial power. If it was a colonial power, you'd have come in, removed Saddam, kept the structures in place and just put in another colonel. They were usually colonels, put them in charge. America's legacy in Iraq is not going to be these beautiful colonial buildings. It's going to be democracy. And to create a democracy, you can't do it from the foundations of the Ba'ath Party.
Bad intentions were never at the heart of the CPA enterprise. There was a vision for a new Iraq, unbuttressed by policies in Washington. At the heart of many objections was the Iraqi National Congress, a grouping of mostly exiles who had opposed Saddam Hussein for many years. Strangely, after the United States had installed exiles in Afghanistan, exiles for Iraq were opposed. Some opposition came from Iran, some from London, some from Washington.
And these were people who didn't have grassroots support, and their knowledge of Iraq was limited. They were seen as foreigners by those Iraqis who had been in Iraq all along. The big division at the time was between those who had been there and the returning exiles. And many of the returning exiles had spent their time in exile in Iran and were connected in ways that we didn't understand to the Islamic Republic.
The problem was, how do you get there from where they were? And the unrealistic ways in which this was gone about. First of all, you fire the one respected institution, the one national institution, the military. Then you do away with all the bureaucrats you need to run the place without a provision for how you could bring them back to work legally, except in one area which had an exception. And then, by the way, we almost fired all the state-owned enterprises. That was the third whammy that was about to happen.
The bath gone, the army gone, the state-owned enterprises almost gone. That last CPA initiative was nipped in the bud, but military commanders and civilian leaders in the field were not consulted. CPA officials stayed in Baghdad, inside the well-armored Green Zone. Others who were meeting real Iraqis recognized there were problems that were invisible to the CPA.
This was part of a plan that was developed in 3 weeks by somebody who showed up in Baghdad, who never left the Green Zone, and all of us, and never vetted it with us. We'd been on the ground for months by that point in time, and had some understanding of the country, certainly far better than those who had just come in. So this is the situation in which we found ourselves in really the late spring and summer of 2003 as the insurgency starts to take root, because the incentive of so many tens of thousands of Iraqis is to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it.
We didn't know how long we were going to be there for. When you start to see rising insurgency, it's then announced that we're going to be leaving in June 2004, that we have to hand over everything to the Iraqis by then. So you see the quick drafting of an interim constitution, the early holding of elections, and the cementing of sectarianism. It's institutionally. And it started with the establishment of the Iraqi Governing Council, having X amount of positions for Shia, for Kurds, for Sunni, for Turkmen, institutionalizing sectarianism and making that, for the first time in Iraq's history, the governance system of a country. And that permeated down everything that we did.
Even as many in the field in Iraq were fretting about the signs of insurgency, Washington remained on schedule to withdraw and hand off governing to Iraqis.
I made my first visit there, I think late June of 2003. And they took me through the intelligence and the pattern of behavior, targeted violence in multiple provinces going on, similar types of violence. And I said, well, what is your conclusion? And the conclusion was that, well, it's not organized. And I said, well, why do you say it's not organized? Well, because there's no headquarters that we can find. And I say, you have on your hands a low-level insurgency. And this is going to grow in scale and size. And I'm telling you, the Army will bear the burden of this, and we are not prepared to fight it. The response to me was, I don't think you should be using those terms around here. And I said, if we don't define the war properly, in terms of what it is we're fighting, how can we possibly succeed at it?
Official Washington was not receptive to Keene's warnings.
We changed CENTCOM commanders from Franks to Abizaid. Abizaid's plan, which I'm intimately familiar with, and on the surface of it, that plan seemed to be okay. The problem is, it did take into consideration what the enemy was doing. Remember, this is Saddam Hussein's Sunni-based insurgency to start with. He had unlimited amount of money, billions and billions of dollars.
Saddam's allies had cash, weapons, and will, and they were gaining strength as Allied plans faltered.
We have the intelligence evidence to prove that we're losing the war significantly in 2004. It goes into the president and his entire national security team is there. The first question he gets, a statement by the President of the United States, is, Colonel, why should I believe anything you're about to tell me? Why is that? Why did that happen? That happened because the groupthink on intelligence at the time was this insurgency is not that much of a problem. I mean, after all, these guys are only walking around with AK-47s, firing RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, and using improvised explosive devices. This is about as low-tech as you can get, and they're up against the mighty West. Problem? Iraqi security forces cannot defeat the insurgency. They don't have the ability to defeat the insurgency without us. But we're transitioning to them. Why? Because we want to leave.
America's desire to leave Iraq coincided with peak chaos on the ground.
There was no electricity, there was no public services. It was absolute hell. And I remember saying to General, oh, you know, this is the greatest strategic disaster in the history of the United States.
At home in the United States and abroad, pessimism over the war was increasing by the day, fueled by the drumbeat of headlines and cable news that reiterated Allied failures.
And then in 2006, the scab really came off the wound. Sunni-based insurgency and the Al-Qaeda made Baghdad a center of gravity. And they went after it with everything they had. Bodies left on the streets, schools shut down, commerce shut down, people not able to work. It was tragic. The United States military ran 2 operations to clear Al-Qaeda and Sunni out of certain neighborhoods. And I asked the commander who's in charge of it, did you leave forces behind to stabilize the neighborhoods and control it? No, sir. I said, we're gonna fail. As soon as you leave, in time, they're gonna come back. And we did it twice. So by end of 2006, we're failing. Iraq is going off the cliff.
Iraq is going off a cliff. And in Washington, there is a growing understanding that something needed to change. Not simply an effort to fight the very people that had attacked us on 9/11 and take on the Iranian and Ba'ath forces that were working with them. America needed an ally on the ground that trusted us. America needed to reassure Iraq that it was serious about the country's future. And it was not simply the Shia of Iraq who had hoped that the country that landed men on the moon could save them from tyranny. It was the Sunni who had lost hope. It was the Kurds whose faith faltered in the United States. Could things be turned around?
Things are going wrong in Iraq. And what do we have? We have Rumsfeld and Abizaid telling the Senate Armed Services Committee that the strategy is working.
Ultimately, the sectarian violence is going to be dealt with by Iraqis, and it's going to be dealt with by Iraqi security forces as a part of the solution, but it's going to be dealt with through a reconciliation process, a political process that Maliki, the Prime Minister, and others in the country are trying to design in a way that it will pull together elements within the country and thereby reduce sectarian violence.
I can assure you, Senator McCain, General Casey and I want to win this war. And if we need to ask for more U.S. troops in the short term or in the long term, we will.
But the critical issue wasn't the number of troops. It was the strategy for using them.
I said, this is an urban insurgency where the center of gravity is in Baghdad and other cities, but the principal place is in Baghdad. We have to put in play counterinsurgency practices to, 1, to protect the population, and 2, attack leaders, to be sure, and attack their support zones. But the principal basis for this is protect the population. And the Iraqis will be side by side with us. But we have to lead in that effort. We got to come outside of our forward operating bases where we have the towers and everything, where we're running these patrols out every single day in vehicles, and put them in the neighborhoods to protect the people. Have them walk in the neighborhoods, protect the people, and watch our soldiers die in those neighborhoods, and then the people will know that we are there for them.
The fact was, there were few in Washington open to this change in strategy. And indeed, the Iraq Study Group, a congressionally appointed bipartisan committee composed of prominent former government officials, suggested a phased withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from Iraq. But there was one individual who wanted to know if there was a way to avoid defeat.
I found myself in front of the President of the United States in the Oval Office with his whole national security team there and took him through this. 3 days later, we got a phone call saying the President's going to change his strategy in Iraq. When I was in the Oval Office, we told him that the man to take charge of this after you remove the generals is General Petraeus. We had consensus, this was the guy we needed, but yet, on-scene commander in Iraq, CENTCOM commander, and the Joint Chiefs were opting for the status quo because the ground forces are stressed and tired. And we were stressed and tired and willing to lose a war over that? How insulting is that to the people that are out there doing the fighting and the dying and the people who are suffering as a result of it?
There was an article in the New York Times that captured what we were doing beautifully. Driving around Baghdad waiting to get blown up. It happens when you get in with the people and you start to make improvements, they start to support you. We have to promote reconciliation. Now, we're Baghdad now. So we do what we know is needed to be done, and very, very slowly over many, many subsequent months after reconstituting the Iraqi forces with a formal process, then allow a gradual transition, a thinning out, not a handing off, and only doing so based on actual conditions on the ground.
A president as chief executive and commander-in-chief has immense power at his disposal. But to change course in the face of large and growing public discontent over Iraq, as President Bush did, was no small effort.
He loses the midterm election over the war in Iraq, 2006, November. He fires Rumsfeld after that.
I'm obviously disappointed with the outcome of the election, and as the head of the Republican Party, I share a large part of the responsibility.
And so he's always had Democratic opposition. Now he's got serious Republican opposition. And he's got a military that's arguing for the status quo, yet he made that decision.
Yeah, it was
it's
very,
pretty
very courageous.
remarkable decision that he made, and he deserves a huge amount of credit for that.
There's really two President Bushes during the course of the Iraq War. There's the one who subcontracts the war to Secretary Rumsfeld until that loss of the midterm in late November 2006, and then there's the one who takes it over in Washington after that. Now the commitment of additional resources and violence is driven down by nearly 90% over the course of the 18 months of the surge.
What happens is now known as the surge.
The mission of these reinforcements would be to implement the thus elusive hold element of the military's clear, hold, build strategy.
The augmentation of forces on the ground to execute a counterinsurgency strategy to clear, hold, and build in Iraq in a way that had not been done previously. It set the stage for military success, for political progress, and for a restoration of confidence in U.S. leadership. It also paved the way to genuine reconciliation.
Now, the Sunni awakening was, again, a really extraordinary event and difficult to understand why did it happen. And so I think it was really when the Sunnis realized that they had lost the civil war and they were going to be exterminated if they didn't separate from Al-Qaeda, that we start to see the awakening. So one of the biggest impacts of the surge, which is very hard to measure, is the psychological impact that it had on Iraqis. It's not, the violence came way down, not because we killed all the bad guys, but Iraqis changed their strategic calculus. And the US was seen as going from being the enabler of Shia militia to now the defenders of the Sunnis from the Shia militias.
The surge had brought peace to the streets of Iraq. Violence was dramatically down, and a sense of normalcy had begun to take hold.
And by the end, by 2009, everyone thought the civil war is ended and Iraq is on the right path. And the elections of 2010 were supposed to bring about this reconciliation. And it was a very tightly contested election in which the incumbent, Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister, lost the election.
Indeed, a cross-sectarian party, Iraqia, the Iraqi National Movement, led by former interim Prime Minister Ayed Alawi, had won the most seats in the Iraqi Assembly. By any measure, it was a positive sign about the possibility of Iraq moving forward.
And there was differences within the US system over how to respond. My old boss, General Odierno, believed that the US should uphold the results of the election and give the winning bloc the first chance to try and form the government, consistent with the Iraqi constitution, consistent with normal practice in a parliamentary system. But the ambassador at the time thought, this is ridiculous. Iraq's not ready for democracy. Iraq needs a Shia strongman, and Nouri al-Maliki is our man. President Obama appointed then Vice President Joe Biden as his point man on Iraq. And Joe Biden came out, listened to both sides of the argument, and said, I understand these people. My grandfather was Irish, he hated the British, it's in their blood. And basically, Nouri al-Maliki is our man. I know this guy, he's an Iraqi nationalist, and let us keep a contingent of troops in Iraq after the security agreement expires at the end of 2011. The Iraqi parliamentary system had been trying to remove Nouri al-Maliki for years through a vote of no confidence, because they were scared he was becoming a dictator like Saddam. And every time they moved to do a vote of no confidence, the US intervened and said, don't do it in Parliament, wait for the elections. Elections come, the people vote to remove Nouri al-Maliki, and the US is trying to pressure them to keep Maliki in place. So this provides an opening for Iran. Up till now, America was seen as the dominant country in Iraq. But the Iranians had a very talented and capable general called Qasem Soleimani, who had known Iraqis for years. But Qasem Soleimani said, support Maliki because he will ensure you get key posts and he will ensure all US forces leave. So both US and Iran end up supporting Nouri al-Maliki for a second time as prime minister, even though he'd lost the elections. Biden thought he had formed the government and hadn't realized it had actually been the Iranians. So securing his seat for a second term, Maliki went after the Sunni politicians of Iraq, accused them of terrorism, forced them to flee the country. He went after the Sunni awakening leaders. They were either assassinated, jailed, or forced to flee.
Amnesty says Shia militias have killed dozens of Sunni civilians in the cities of Baghdad, Samarra, and Kirkuk. Hundreds of victims were reportedly found handcuffed and shot in the back of the head in execution-style killings.
And he subverted the judiciary. When there started to be Sunni protests, he sent in the Iraqi security forces to crush them. And this created the conditions for ISIS to rise up out of the ashes of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had been completely defeated. The Iraqi security forces that we had trained and equipped and spent $8 million on, Maliki had replaced those leaders who were close to the US. He removed them and replaced them with leaders who were close to him, who didn't have military training, and they used the funding for the military. They pocketed it. And so the Iraqi security forces that outnumbered ISIS by about 100 to 1 fled. They took off their uniforms, they left all their US-supplied equipment, masses of it, for ISIS to take over.
The surge snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. However, by 2009, President Obama and Vice President Biden entered office. Neither was interested in the fate of Iraqi democracy or the American security mission there. Iraq was, candidate Obama said, a war of choice. And once elected, the choice was to get out. In doing so precipitously, Obama and Biden reversed the gains made with the surge and created the political and military opening for the growth of ISIS and its conquest of vast areas of Iraq and Syria. Solving this problem would make the surge look like a walk in the park.